Some storms don't wash danger away, they deliver it to your doorstep. Rain fell over downtown Boston in silver sheets, turning every streetlight into a trembling halo and every passing car into a blurred streak of white and red. Claire Dawson pulled the hood of her faded grey sweatshirt lower as she hurried through the empty sidewalk, her sneakers splashing through shallow puddles that had already soaked through the fabric hours ago. She wasn't running because of the weather. She was running because every instinct she trusted kept whispering the same warning. Don't stop, don't look back. The grocery store where she worked had closed nearly 40 minutes earlier, but she had spent another half hour inside pretending to reorganize inventory after spotting two unfamiliar men waiting across the street. They never came inside, they simply watched the entrance with patient expressions that made her stomach tighten. By the time she finally slipped out through the rear loading dock, they were gone, at least she had wanted to believe they were. The wind carried the sharp scent of rain and wet concrete as Claire crossed another intersection, clutching the worn canvas backpack against her chest. Inside were nothing more than a spare sweater, her wallet, and the folder containing paperwork for the nursing program she had spent 3 years trying to afford. Every double shift, every skipped vacation, every dollar saved had led toward one dream that suddenly felt painfully fragile tonight. A delivery truck rolled past, sending water across the curb. Claire stepped back, brushing soaked strands of blonde hair away from her face before glancing over her shoulder again. The street behind her looked empty, too empty. A city block that usually buzzed with late-night restaurants now felt strangely abandoned beneath the pounding rain. She told herself she was imagining things. Stress had a way of inventing monsters where none existed. Unfortunately for her, someone really was watching. Less than a mile away, two black sedans turned slowly onto the same avenue, their headlights cutting through the rain with deliberate precision. Claire knew nothing about them. She only felt the strange pressure building in her chest, the invisible sensation that someone else's decision had quietly become part of her night. She turned down a narrower side street lined with brick buildings and closed cafes, hoping the shortcut would shave 10 minutes off her walk to the subway station. Thunder rolled somewhere above the skyline. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Then again. Finally only her own reflection staring back at her through cracked glass. She slipped the phone into her pocket without answering. Ahead, the traffic light changed from green to yellow. A handful of cars slowed while others accelerated through the intersection before the signal turned red. Claire wrapped both arms around herself as another gust of cold rain swept across the sidewalk. Her breathing came faster now, not from exhaustion but from the growing certainty that someone else occupied the silence around her. Then she heard footsteps, slow, measured. Behind her, she resisted every urge to turn immediately. Instead, she kept walking, forcing herself to maintain the same pace. The footsteps remained, not gaining, not fading, matching her one block, then another. Her pulse climbed higher. Finally, she looked over her shoulder. Two men in dark jackets had just rounded the corner she had crossed moments earlier. They weren't running. They weren't calling her name. They simply continued walking with calm expressions that somehow felt far more unsettling than panic ever could. Claire faced forward again, swallowing hard. Maybe they weren't following her. Maybe this was all coincidence. The first lie comforted her for 3 seconds. The second disappeared when she crossed another intersection and heard the footsteps do exactly the same. Rainwater streamed from the edge of her hood as she quickened her pace. So did they. The city suddenly felt much larger than it had 20 minutes ago. Every storefront looked closed. Every apartment window seemed dark. Even the passing traffic had thinned until only the sound of rain remained. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the storm itself. She turned sharply into a covered parking entrance, hoping to disappear long enough for whoever was behind her to continue walking. Instead, she found herself standing beside a long black luxury sedan parked beneath the concrete overhang, its engine humming almost silently while raindrops slid across polished paint like liquid glass. The rear passenger door opened before she could step away. Claire froze. Inside sat a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal coat, one hand resting calmly against the leather seat beside him. His dark hair was damp from the weather, but his expression remained composed, almost impossibly still amid the chaos outside. He didn't smile, he didn't introduce himself. He simply looked directly at Claire with steady blue-grey eyes that revealed nothing. Then he spoke in a voice so quiet she almost mistook it for the rain. "If you stay out there for another 30 seconds, they'll find you before the police ever do." Claire stared at the stranger, unable to decide which frightened her more, the men still approaching through the rain, or the man who already seemed to know they were coming. Claire did not move. Rain continued to pour beyond the shelter of the parking entrance, each drop striking the pavement with a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. The two men were still approaching from the opposite end of the block, their figures softened by the curtain of water, but impossible to mistake now. The stranger inside the sedan never raised his voice. He simply waited as though he had already accepted that the next decision belonged entirely to her. Claire tightened her grip on her backpack. Every lesson she had ever learned about personal safety told her never to get into a stranger's car. Every instinct she possessed tonight warned that remaining where she stood might be even worse. She searched the man's face for some sign of urgency, anger, or deception. Instead, she found remarkable stillness. It unsettled her more than fear would have. The rear door remained open, warm light spilling onto the wet concrete. Finally, she stepped forward, slowly enough that she could still change her mind. The moment she settled onto the leather seat, the door closed with a quiet click that almost disappeared beneath the storm. The driver eased the sedan away from the curb without accelerating, blending naturally into the thin flow of downtown traffic. Nobody inside spoke for several long seconds. Claire became painfully aware of the soft hum of the engine, the scent of cedar and clean leather, and the steady tapping of rain against the windows. She glanced toward the front windshield before looking back through the rear glass. The two men reached the parking entrance just as the sedan turned the corner. One of them stopped beneath the concrete overhang, scanning the street with visible frustration before both figures disappeared behind the rain. Claire released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. The man beside her looked forward rather than at her. "Someone who prefers not to leave innocent people standing in dangerous places." His answer sounded practiced, neither warm nor cold. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you need tonight." Claire frowned. "How did you know they were following me?" The silence stretched again. The driver adjusted the windshield wipers as another burster swept across the boulevard. Outside, Boston glowed beneath reflections of neon signs and traffic lights that shimmered across flooded pavement. Finally, the man spoke. Because they were not trying very hard to hide it. Claire folded her arms. "I do not even know those men. That may be true." He paused. "It may also be exactly what makes this dangerous." She turned toward him fully now. Up close, he looked younger than she had first guessed, perhaps early 30s, with dark hair neatly combed back and calm blue-gray eyes that seemed to notice everything without lingering on any single detail. His charcoal overcoat fit with effortless precision, and although there was nothing flashy about him, quiet authority filled the space around him. Claire had met wealthy people before, while delivering groceries to expensive neighborhoods. None of them carried themselves quite like this. "You still have not told me your name," she said. He looked out the side window as the sedan crossed a bridge overlooking the rain-covered Charles River. "Sebastian Romano." The name settled into the silence. Claire repeated it softly, testing whether she had heard correctly. It sounded familiar, although she could not remember why. "Claire Dawson," she replied after a moment. "I already know." Her eyes widened. "How?" Sebastian shifted his attention toward her for the first time since the car had started moving. "Your employee identification badge is still clipped inside your pocket." Claire looked down immediately and found the corner of the plastic badge visible beneath her soaked sweatshirt. She almost laughed from embarrassment before realizing that explanation only answered part of her question. He had observed her before she entered the car. He noticed details quickly, perhaps too quickly. What she did not know was that someone else had recognized her long before tonight. Less than 15 minutes earlier, a photograph carrying her name had quietly circulated between several phones across the city. The message contained only one instruction: find her before midnight. Claire stared out the rain-covered window again. "Can you please take me to the nearest subway station?" Sebastian answered without hesitation. "No." She looked back sharply. "No, not tonight." "You cannot decide that for me. You are correct." His tone remained composed. "But if those men are waiting there, sending you alone would be irresponsible." Claire felt irritation replace some of her fear. "You expect me to trust someone I met 30 seconds ago?" "No." He folded his hands calmly. "I expect you to trust what you have already seen." She wanted to argue. Instead, she replayed the last 15 minutes in her mind. The footsteps, the empty streets, the black sedan, the open door arriving at exactly the right moment. None of it made sense. The city skyline slowly disappeared behind them as the vehicle entered a quieter neighborhood lined with historic brick buildings and iron fences glistening beneath the storm. The driver reduced speed before turning through tall wrought iron gates that opened without anyone leaving the vehicle. Claire stared ahead as the estate emerged through the rain, its warm lights glowing against dark stone walls like a place untouched by the chaos outside. Her pulse began to climb once more. She had escaped one mystery only to arrive inside another, and as the gates closed silently behind them, she realized there was no longer any simple path back to the life she had left less than an hour earlier. Claire stepped out of the sedan with reluctant hesitation, her soaked sneakers sinking slightly into the rain-darkened gravel as she looked up at the estate. The mansion did not resemble the extravagant palaces she had seen in movies. It was quieter than that, older. Built from weathered grey stone that seemed to belong to another century, its tall windows glowing with warm amber light against the storm. Every detail whispered wealth without ever needing to announce it. A man holding a black umbrella approached the rear door, but Sebastian gave the slightest shake of his head before opening his own umbrella instead. He offered it toward Claire without speaking. She accepted after a brief pause, surprised that he chose to walk beside her through the rain rather than allowing someone else to escort her inside. The front doors opened before they reached the entrance. Soft light spilled across polished hardwood floors, replacing the cold smell of rain with cedar, fresh coffee, and the faint scent of a fireplace somewhere deeper inside the house. Claire hesitated at the threshold. Her grandmother had once told her that some doors changed a person's life forever. Standing there, she wondered whether this might become one of them. A middle-aged woman wearing an elegant navy sweater greeted them with a gentle smile that immediately felt more welcoming than anything Claire had expected. "Good evening, Mr. Romano," she said before turning toward Claire. "You must be freezing. Let us get you something warm." Claire looked instinctively toward Sebastian, uncertain whether she should answer. He simply nodded once. "Mrs. Ellis manages the house," he said. "You are safe here." Safe. The word echoed strangely inside her mind. She had heard it twice tonight, yet she still could not convince herself to believe it completely. Mrs. Ellis disappeared briefly before returning with a thick towel and a steaming mug of hot chocolate instead of coffee. "Most people need comfort before caffeine," she said kindly. Claire accepted both with quiet gratitude. The warmth spreading through her hands felt almost unreal after nearly an hour in the cold rain. Sebastian removed his overcoat and handed it to another staff member before leading Claire into a library overlooking the back gardens. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. A fire burned steadily inside a stone fireplace. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows while the rest of the estate remained remarkably quiet. "Please sit," Sebastian said. Claire chose the chair closest to the door without realizing she had done so. Old habits, always knowing where the nearest exit was. Sebastian noticed but made no comment. Instead, he poured himself a cup of black tea before sitting across from her. Several moments passed in silence. Claire studied him carefully. Nothing about his movements felt rushed. He never checked his phone, never glanced toward the windows. He carried himself like a man accustomed to remaining calm while everyone else lost theirs. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked. Sebastian rested his cup on the table. "Because someone should. People do not usually bring strangers to private estates out of kindness." "No," he admitted, "most do not." She waited for him to continue. He did not. The silence almost became another language between them. Claire looked around the room instead. Family photographs were surprisingly absent. There were paintings of coastal landscapes, antique clocks, and shelves filled with history books, but nothing personal. The house felt lived in without revealing who actually lived there. What she could not see were the discreet security monitors installed in another room down the hallway. At that exact moment, several camera feeds displayed different entrances around the property, while trusted employees quietly confirmed that no unfamiliar vehicles had approached the gates. Sebastian had not invited danger inside with Claire. He had simply chosen to place it farther away. Claire placed the empty mug on the table. "If those men were looking for me, I deserve to know why." Sebastian folded his hands together. "Do you remember anything unusual from today?" She searched her memory. Morning classes, her shift at the grocery store, helping an elderly customer carry bags to her car, restocking canned soup, nothing extraordinary. She slowly shook her head. No. Did anyone ask unusual questions? Again she thought carefully. Then one memory surfaced. A man bought bottled water about an hour before closing. He asked whether I always worked Friday nights. Sebastian's expression remained controlled, but something subtle shifted in his eyes. Did you answer? I said sometimes. Did he give his name? No. Claire leaned forward. Does that matter? Sebastian looked toward the fire for several quiet seconds before answering. It might, she frowned. Every answer seemed to create two more questions. Outside, thunder rolled across the city once again. Claire suddenly remembered her phone and reached into her pocket. The screen lit up with 17 missed calls from the same unknown number. Beneath them waited a single voicemail that had arrived only 3 minutes earlier. Her thumb hovered over the notification. Do not play it yet, Sebastian said calmly. Claire looked up in surprise. How did you know it was a voicemail? Because whoever wants your attention is becoming impatient. She stared at him, uncertainty mixing with growing curiosity. For the first time that evening, fear was no longer the strongest emotion she felt. It was the need to understand why an ordinary nursing student had somehow become connected to a man whose quiet authority seemed capable of changing the course of an entire night. Then the estate's grandfather clock echoed softly through the library. 11 slow chimes filled the room, and before the final note faded away, one of Sebastian's security advisors appeared silently at the doorway. He did not look at Claire. He looked only at Sebastian before speaking 6 carefully chosen words. They found the apartment building already, sir. Claire's fingers tightened around the phone until the edges pressed into her palm. The security advisor remained at the doorway, waiting without another word. Sebastian stood slowly, his expression unchanged, but the quiet atmosphere inside the library shifted almost imperceptibly. The fire still crackled, rain still tapped against the windows, yet the room suddenly felt smaller, as though the outside world had taken one careful step closer. What do you mean they found my apartment? Claire asked, rising from her chair. Sebastian looked toward the advisor. How long ago? 3 minutes. They remained outside only briefly. Sebastian nodded once. Keep watching. The advisor disappeared as silently as he had arrived. Claire searched Sebastian's face for reassurance, but found only thoughtful concentration. You already knew where I lived, she said quietly. No? Sebastian answered. My team confirmed your address after you entered the car. If someone is trying to locate you, we cannot protect what we do not understand. Protect me from what? He met her eyes for a long moment. That is the question I have been trying to answer since this evening. Claire felt frustration rising beneath the exhaustion. I am just a grocery store clerk. I am trying to finish nursing school. I do not know wealthy people. I do not know criminals. I do not know anyone who would send strangers after me. Sebastian remained silent long enough for her words to settle. Then he asked, Have you misplaced anything recently? She blinked. No. Accepted a package by mistake? No. Helped someone you did not know? Claire hesitated. The image returned almost immediately. An elderly woman struggling with several heavy grocery bags beneath the rain earlier that afternoon. Claire had walked her across the parking lot and helped place the bags into the trunk of a small blue sedan. The woman had thanked her warmly before driving away. There was one customer, Claire admitted. She was older, maybe in her 70s. I carried her groceries because it started raining. Sebastian listened carefully without interrupting. Did she say anything unusual? Claire closed her eyes, replaying the conversation. The woman had smiled, apologized for moving slowly, mentioned that her grandson worried too much, then thanked Claire twice before leaving. Nothing else. No, Claire finally whispered. It felt completely ordinary. Sebastian leaned back slightly. Sometimes ordinary moments matter long before anyone realizes they do. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows. Every answer seemed to move farther away instead of closer. Mrs. Ellis entered quietly, carrying a folded set of dry clothes. I thought these might be more comfortable, she said kindly. One of the guest rooms has already been prepared. Claire accepted the clothes almost automatically. Thank you, Mrs. Ellis smiled gently before leaving as quietly as she had arrived. Claire looked down at the neatly folded sweater and comfortable lounge pants. Everything inside the estate felt strangely thoughtful. Nobody demanded anything from her, nobody rushed her, that somehow made trusting the place even more difficult. I cannot stay here, she said. My classes start tomorrow morning. Tomorrow has not arrived yet, Sebastian replied. Tonight comes first. Claire sighed softly. People are probably wondering where I am. Have you told anyone your plans this evening? She thought for a moment. Only my co-worker. I said I was taking the subway home. Sebastian nodded almost to himself. Good. Good? It means fewer people know your movement's changed. Claire frowned again. You keep speaking as though this is some kind of investigation, because it has become one. What Claire did not know was that another quiet conversation had already begun inside the estate's security office. Digital maps filled several monitors while camera footage from nearby streets played silently across large screens. The unknown vehicles seen near Claire's apartment had already disappeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. No threats had been made, no crime had occurred, only careful observation. And sometimes careful observation was far more difficult to explain than open hostility. Claire slipped her phone back into her pocket without listening to the voicemail. She trusted neither the message nor her own curiosity anymore. If I stay, she asked softly, what happens tomorrow? Sebastian walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Tomorrow we begin finding out why an ordinary evening stopped being ordinary. Claire followed his gaze. Beyond the glass, rows of stone pathways reflected the warm lights of the estate while rain drifted gently across the gardens like silver mist. For the first time since leaving work, she realized she no longer heard footsteps behind her. The silence should have brought comfort. Instead, it left room for questions that refused to disappear. Somewhere beyond the estate walls, someone had searched for her apartment. Somewhere in the city, 17 unanswered calls still waited inside her phone, and standing only a few feet away, Sebastian Romano appeared to know just enough to keep her safe while revealing almost nothing that would let her understand why. Then the lights flickered once before returning to normal, and a soft notification sounded from Sebastian's phone. He glanced at the screen only briefly. His expression did not change, but he slipped the phone into his pocket with unusual speed. Claire noticed the movement immediately. Whatever message had just arrived, it was the first thing all night that Sebastian had chosen not to let her see. Claire barely slept. The guest room overlooking the eastern gardens was warm, quiet, and more comfortable than anywhere she had stayed in years. Yet every unfamiliar sound kept pulling her awake. The rain finally faded sometime before dawn, leaving only the occasional whisper of wind brushing through the trees beyond the windows. She stood beside the glass as the first pale light spread across the estate, revealing carefully trimmed hedges, stone pathways, and an iron fountain reflecting the early morning sky. It should have looked peaceful. Instead, it felt strangely isolated, as though the world beyond the gates had quietly disappeared overnight. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying a breakfast tray with oatmeal, fresh fruit, toast, and hot tea. "You should eat before making any decisions," she said with a kind smile. Claire thanked her and hesitated before asking the question that followed her since midnight. "Does this happen often?" Mrs. Ellis paused only briefly. "Unexpected guests? No. Mr. Romano values quiet more than almost anything." The answer revealed very little, yet it somehow sounded honest. After breakfast, Claire changed into her own clothes, now freshly dried, and made her way downstairs. She found Sebastian standing alone in a sunlit conservatory filled with tall green plants and white orchids. Morning light softened the sharp lines of his charcoal sweater, making him appear less distant than he had the night before. He was reading several printed pages instead of looking at a computer screen. As Claire approached, he placed the papers neatly on the table without hiding them, though the text remained too far away to read. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little. That is more than I expected." She folded her arms. "I still need to leave." Sebastian nodded calmly. "I assumed you would say that." Claire frowned, almost disappointed that he was not arguing. "You are not going to stop me?" "No." He looked toward the gardens. "I only ask that you let my driver take you wherever you decide to go." "You still think someone is following me?" "I think someone was interested enough to find your apartment before sunrise." Claire sighed. "That still does not explain why." Sebastian walked toward a nearby table where yesterday's voicemail notification was displayed on Claire's phone. "Have you listened to it?" "No. Would you like to?" Claire stared at the screen. Curiosity had grown heavier than fear. She pressed play. For several seconds, only static filled the room. Then an older woman's trembling voice emerged through the speaker. "If this message reaches the young woman from the grocery store, I am sorry. None of this was supposed to involve you. Please, do not go hoarding," ended abruptly. Claire looked at the phone in stunned silence. "That is her," she whispered. "The woman from yesterday." Sebastian watched her carefully. "Are you certain? I would recognize her voice." Claire replayed the message once more. The apology sounded sincere, frightened, completely different from the cheerful customer she had helped carry groceries through the rain. "Why would she leave me a voicemail?" she asked. "She never asked for my number." Sebastian remained thoughtful. Did you give the store your contact information for customer deliveries? Claire nodded slowly. Emergency contact forms, employee records. She stopped speaking as the realization settled over her. Someone accessed them. Sebastian did not confirm or deny the conclusion. Someone found a way to reach you. Claire felt the room grow strangely quiet again. Everything she believed to be ordinary now seemed connected by invisible threads she had never noticed before. What she did not know was that the elderly woman had also disappeared from her own neighborhood less than an hour before leaving that message. No one at the estate had discovered that detail yet. The mystery remained incomplete, waiting for pieces that had not surfaced. Claire looked directly at Sebastian. You said we needed answers, then let me help find them. Sebastian studied her expression for a long moment. He saw exhaustion, uncertainty, and fear, but beneath all three, something steadier remained: determination. Most people would choose to walk away, he said quietly. Claire managed a faint smile. Most people were not told not to go home by a stranger they tried to help. The corner of Sebastian's mouth lifted almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. Fair enough. A soft knock interrupted them. One of the security advisors entered, carrying a thin manila folder. We found security footage from the grocery store parking lot, he said. There is something you both need to see. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken again. The answers she had been searching for might finally exist somewhere inside that folder. She had no idea that opening it would raise an even more unsettling question than any she had asked so far. The security advisor placed the manila folder on the polished oak table with deliberate care, as though even the paper inside deserved caution. Claire remained standing while Sebastian opened it and spread several printed images beneath the morning light. They were grainy security camera stills captured from different angles around the grocery store parking lot. At first they appeared ordinary. Customers pushing shopping carts, families loading groceries, employees gathering carts near the entrance. Then Claire recognized herself walking beside the elderly woman through the rain, one hand steadying the shopping cart while the other held an umbrella over both of them. She remembered smiling when the woman joked that old age always arrived faster than expected. The memory felt strangely warm compared to everything that had followed. Sebastian slid another photograph closer. This one had been taken less than 30 seconds later. Claire was helping place grocery bags into the trunk of the woman's blue sedan. Behind them, nearly hidden by another vehicle, stood a man wearing a dark baseball cap. His face was impossible to identify, but he was looking directly toward Claire rather than the customer. I never noticed him, Claire whispered. You were focused on helping someone, Sebastian replied. That is usually when people stop noticing the rest of the world. The advisor turned another page. A second camera angle showed the same man speaking briefly into a phone before walking away. Nothing threatening, nothing dramatic. Yet the timing felt impossible to ignore.
Can you identify him? Claire asked.
The advisor shook his head. Not yet. He stayed outside camera range whenever possible. Sebastian studied the sequence carefully. Show me the final image. The advisor placed the last photograph beside the others. Claire felt her pulse quicken immediately. It showed the elderly woman reaching into her purse before handing Claire something small enough to disappear inside her palm. Claire frowned in confusion. That never happened. She leaned closer. I would remember. Sebastian looked from the photograph to Claire without speaking. She searched her memory again. The grocery bags, the umbrella, the kind smile, the farewell. Nothing about receiving an object. Nothing at all. Could the camera angle be misleading? She asked. Possibly, Sebastian answered. Or you accepted something without realizing its importance. Claire instinctively checked the pockets of her jacket, then opened her backpack on the table. Inside were textbooks, pens, her wallet, a notebook, and the folded nursing application paperwork she carried almost everywhere. Nothing unusual. She looked almost embarrassed by the search. There is nothing here. Sebastian nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps whatever matters is something you already owned. Claire stared at him. You think I have been carrying it this entire time? I think we should avoid conclusions until we have evidence. His calmness remained almost frustrating. Every new discovery seemed to make him even more patient, while Claire felt herself becoming increasingly restless. What she did not know was that another member of Sebastian's team had quietly expanded the investigation beyond the grocery store. Traffic cameras across several nearby intersections had already confirmed that the same dark sedan appeared near Claire's workplace twice during the previous week. No direct contact, no obvious pursuit. Only careful observation that had begun before yesterday's rainstorm. Those details had not yet reached the library. Claire slowly organized the contents of her backpack again before her fingers paused on a folded receipt tucked between two textbooks. She did not remember placing it there. "What is this?" she asked quietly. She unfolded the paper. It was not a receipt at all. It was a handwritten note on plain white stationery. The ink had blurred slightly from moisture, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists." Claire's eyes widened. She must have slipped this into my bag while I was loading her groceries. Sebastian accepted the note carefully, reading it twice before turning it over. The back appeared blank except for a faint embossed symbol pressed into the paper itself. It was almost invisible unless the light struck it from the side, a small compass surrounded by a circle of tiny stars. Claire leaned closer. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. "I have seen that symbol before." Claire immediately looked up. "Where?" He traced the edge of the paper with one finger. "Years ago. Is it a company? No. A charity? No." "Then what?" Sebastian carefully placed the note back onto the table. "That is exactly what I intend to find out before someone else reaches you first." Claire watched him closely. It was the first time since they had met that his certainty had given way to genuine uncertainty. Whatever the small embossed symbol represented, it was familiar enough to disturb even a man who rarely seemed surprised. And somewhere beyond the estate walls, another person had already begun searching for the same answer. Claire remained motionless as Sebastian held the small note beneath the morning light, tilting it just enough for the embossed compass to catch a pale reflection. Outside the conservatory, sunlight finally broke through the retreating clouds, filling the gardens with quiet warmth that seemed completely disconnected from the uncertainty growing inside the estate. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Claire had begun to realize that every rushed conclusion they had made during the past 12 hours had only created more questions. Sebastian finally placed the note inside a transparent document sleeve before looking toward one of the advisors waiting discreetly near the doorway. "Call the archive room," he said calmly. "Bring me every file connected to this symbol." The advisor nodded and disappeared without another word. Claire watched the exchange with growing curiosity. "You have an archive?" she asked. Sebastian gave a small nod. "Information is often more valuable than money." "You still have not told me what you think that symbol means, because I no longer trust what I thought I knew." That answer surprised her more than any confident explanation could have. Until now, Sebastian had always seemed certain, always one step ahead of every conversation. Seeing even a trace of uncertainty made him appear unexpectedly human. Mrs. Ellis entered carrying fresh tea, quietly replacing the empty cups before leaving them alone again. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug without taking a sip. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Of course. Last night, when you opened your car door, was that a coincidence?" Sebastian looked toward the gardens before answering. "No." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. "Then you were waiting for me." "I was waiting for someone else," she frowned. "Someone else?" "One of my associates noticed unfamiliar vehicles circling several downtown blocks. We believed they were watching a business contact. Instead, they ignored him completely." He met her eyes. "Then they started following you." Claire struggled to absorb the information. "So I was never the original target. That is what I believed." He paused briefly. "Now I am no longer certain." The words settled heavily between them. For the first time, the mystery shifted. Until this moment, Claire had assumed she had accidentally crossed paths with someone dangerous. Now another possibility quietly emerged. Perhaps the encounter with the elderly woman had not been random at all. What she did not know was that the archive room beneath the estate contained decades of carefully preserved records collected from business dealings, charitable foundations, historical societies, and private investigations. Less than 5 minutes later, one of Sebastian's oldest advisors was already searching through boxes that had not been opened in years. Upstairs, Claire looked down at the folded note once more. "She thanked me for kindness," Claire whispered. She sounded like someone who already knew she was in trouble. Sebastian nodded slowly. "People sometimes recognize danger before they recognize rescue." Claire stared out the window. "If she trusted me enough to leave this, then I cannot pretend none of this happened." Sebastian studied her expression carefully. "Most people would choose distance. I am not most people." The answer came naturally. She surprised herself by how certain she sounded. Sebastian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No," he replied quietly. "You are not." Before either of them spoke again, the advisor returned carrying a single weathered leather binder instead of several files. "This was all we found," he explained. "There is only one documented reference." Sebastian opened the binder carefully. Inside rested a faded newspaper clipping protected beneath clear plastic. The article was nearly 20 years old. The headline had partially faded with age, but one sentence remained readable. "Anonymous Foundation donates millions after coastal hurricane relief." Beneath the headline appeared the same embossed compass surrounded by tiny stars. Claire looked confused. "A charity?" Sebastian slowly shook his head. That is what everyone believed. He turned another page. The following sheet contained no article at all, only a handwritten note made years earlier by someone inside his own organization. The ink had faded but remained legible. "If this symbol ever appears again, contact the benefactor immediately." Claire looked back at Sebastian. "Unknown? For 2 decades," he answered. "Nobody discovered who financed those donations." She blinked in disbelief. "You are telling me an anonymous person gave away millions of dollars, disappeared, and nobody ever found out who they were?" Sebastian closed the binder gently. "Exactly." Claire glanced toward the folded note resting beside her tea. "Then maybe the woman I helped knows." Sebastian did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the window where sunlight now illuminated the rain-soaked gardens with remarkable clarity. "I think," he said quietly, "the woman you helped may have been trying to lead someone to the truth before she vanished." Claire felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. The strange night, she believed, had begun with 2 men following her through the rain, suddenly stretched much farther into the past than she had ever imagined. And somewhere beyond the estate, another person had just learned that the forgotten compass symbol had surfaced once again. The leather binder remained open on the conservatory table long after the conversation had ended, its faded pages quietly connecting 2 decades of unanswered questions with a single act of kindness in a grocery store parking lot. Claire could not stop looking at the small compass symbol pressed into the note. It no longer seemed like an ordinary mark left by a grateful stranger. It felt like the first piece of a much larger story that someone had desperately tried to protect. Sebastian closed the binder carefully and looked toward one of his advisors. "I want every public record connected to the Hurricane Relief Foundation, board members, financial statements, volunteer lists, anything that still exists," the advisor nodded. "Most of those records are archived, then we will retrieve them." Claire watched the quiet efficiency with which everyone inside the estate moved. Nobody questioned instructions. Nobody raised their voice. There was no chaos, only disciplined purpose. She realized that Sebastian had built a world where preparation mattered more than reaction. It explained why he had found her before the men on the street reached her. It also explained why he never seemed surprised for very long. Mrs. Ellis returned carrying a light lunch, insisting that both of them eat before continuing. Claire almost declined until she noticed Sebastian quietly accepting his own plate without protest. The simple gesture somehow made the enormous estate feel less intimidating. They ate in comfortable silence while sunlight drifted across the conservatory floor, replacing the darkness that had defined the previous night. For the first time since entering the mansion, Claire noticed birds gathering near the stone fountain outside. The ordinary sight reminded her that the rest of the city had already returned to normal. Students were walking to class, stores were opening, traffic was filling the streets. Only her life had changed overnight. "You are thinking about leaving again," Sebastian said without looking up from his tea. Claire smiled faintly. "Am I that obvious? Only because you keep looking toward the front gates." She laughed softly before becoming serious again. "I keep wondering whether I should pretend none of this happened." Sebastian folded his hands. "Could you?" Claire considered the question honestly. She imagined returning to work, stocking grocery shelves, attending nursing lectures, and pretending she had never heard the frightened voicemail or seen the old newspaper clipping. The picture felt impossible now. She slowly shook her head. "No." Sebastian nodded once, as though he had expected exactly that answer. "Then the only path forward is understanding why this started." Before Claire could respond, another advisor entered carrying a slim tablet instead of a folder. "We located one surviving foundation volunteer," he said. "She is 91 years old and lives in a retirement community on the North Shore." Claire immediately looked up. "She is still alive?" "According to public records, yes." The advisor placed the tablet on the table, displaying an old photograph of volunteers distributing food and blankets after the hurricane. Most faces were too blurry to recognize. One woman stood near the center wearing a raincoat with the familiar compass emblem stitched onto the sleeve. Claire leaned closer. That is her. The room fell silent. Sebastian studied the image carefully before turning toward Claire. You are certain? Older now, of course, but I would know those eyes anywhere. She is the woman from the grocery store. Even the advisor looked surprised. The photograph was taken 19 years ago. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. Then she has been connected to this symbol for almost 20 years. Sebastian looked thoughtful, and somehow she found you. What Claire did not know was that another discovery had arrived only moments earlier from a separate investigation. The license plate of the blue sedan driven by the elderly woman had finally been identified. The vehicle had been registered under a charitable trust rather than a private owner, adding yet another layer to the mystery. Sebastian had not shared that information yet. He wanted confirmation before raising more questions. Claire looked back at the old photograph. If she is still alive, we should talk to her. Sebastian remained quiet for several seconds before answering. I agree. Then what are we waiting for? He looked toward the bright afternoon sky beyond the conservatory windows. Timing, Claire frowned, because someone else may already be asking the same questions. Her expression slowly changed. She was beginning to understand how carefully every decision mattered inside Sebastian's world. Rushing toward answers without preparation could close doors instead of opening them. Sebastian stood and walked toward the window overlooking the front drive. Several black vehicles remained parked beyond the circular fountain, ready without appearing threatening. We leave at first light tomorrow, he said. Today we prepare. Claire joined him beside the glass, watching sunlight shimmer across the rain-washed gardens. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been hurrying home with nothing more than textbooks and groceries on her mind. Now she was preparing to meet the only living person who might explain why a forgotten symbol, an anonymous fortune, and a frightened voicemail had quietly drawn her into a story that had begun long before she ever noticed someone following her through the rain. The estate awakened long before sunrise. Soft lights glowed beneath covered walkways while quiet footsteps echoed through polished halls. Claire stood beside the bedroom window watching pale blue light slowly replace the darkness above the trees. She had expected another restless night, but exhaustion had finally overcome uncertainty. For the first time since everything began, she had slept without waking to imagined footsteps outside her door. Downstairs, the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the dining room. Sebastian was already reviewing several folders spread neatly across the table. He looked up as Claire entered, closing one of the files without hurry. Good morning, he said. Did anything change overnight? Claire asked immediately. Yes. Sebastian slid a folded map across the table. The retirement community confirmed that the woman checked out yesterday morning. She told the staff she had an appointment in Boston. Claire's shoulders sank. So we missed her, not necessarily. He pointed to a small circle marked along the North Shore. She never returned, but she also never cancelled today's volunteer visit at a local community center. Claire looked at him hopefully. You think she planned to go there? People who spend decades helping others rarely abandon commitments without reason. Mrs. Ellis placed breakfast in front of them before quietly leaving again. Claire forced herself to eat, even though anticipation had replaced her appetite. Every answer seemed close enough to reach now, yet she had learned that every discovery carried another layer beneath it. After breakfast, Sebastian handed her a lightweight navy rain jacket. The forecast says scattered showers this afternoon. Claire smiled faintly. You prepare for everything, do not you? I try. His answer carried no pride, only simple honesty. Less than an hour later, the black sedan rolled through the estate gates and merged onto the quiet morning roads leading toward the coast. The storm had washed the city clean. Brick buildings glowed beneath fresh sunlight, coffee shops filled with commuters, and children waited beside school buses carrying backpacks almost as large as themselves. Claire watched ordinary life pass beyond the window with a strange feeling of distance. Barely 48 hours earlier, she had belonged completely to that world. Now she was only observing it from behind tinted glass. Do you ever miss being anonymous? She asked unexpectedly. Sebastian looked out at the passing streets before answering. Every day. The answer surprised her. Then why keep living like this? He remained silent for several moments. Because sometimes responsibility chooses people before they choose it. Claire thought about those words as the city slowly disappeared behind them. What she still did not know was that the unknown men searching for her had already realized she was no longer at her apartment. Their attention had quietly shifted toward another possibility. If Claire could not be found, perhaps the elderly woman could. Nearly an hour later, the sedan entered a quiet seaside town where white churches, family-owned diners and small bookstores lined the peaceful main street. The community center sat beside a public park overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Wind carried the scent of salt water while seagulls circled lazily above the harbor. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. Sebastian remained inside the vehicle for several extra seconds, studying the surroundings before stepping out. Claire followed, adjusting the borrowed jacket against the cool breeze. Volunteers were arranging folding tables beneath colorful tents for a weekend food drive. Children chased one another across the grass while older couples carried boxes of donated supplies toward the entrance. Claire searched every face she could see. "I do not see her, neither do I," Sebastian admitted. They walked slowly toward the registration table where a cheerful volunteer greeted them with an easy smile. Claire showed the photograph from the tablet. "Have you seen this woman today?" The volunteer looked carefully before nodding. "She was here early this morning. She left about 20 minutes ago." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. "Did she say where she was going?" The volunteer smiled apologetically. "Only that she had one last place to visit before she could finally rest." Claire and Sebastian exchanged a quiet glance. Those words carried far more weight than the volunteer could possibly understand. "Did she leave anything?" Sebastian asked gently. The volunteer hesitated before reaching beneath the registration table. "Actually, yes." She lifted a small, sealed envelope with Claire's name written neatly across the front in careful handwriting. She said if a young woman with kind eyes arrived asking questions, this belonged to her. Claire stared at the envelope without moving. Her name had been written there long before she ever decided to leave the estate that morning. The woman had expected her to come. Somehow she had known. Claire accepted the envelope with both hands, almost afraid that moving too quickly might somehow erase the moment. The paper felt ordinary, cream-colored, slightly worn along the edges, yet her name had been written with careful precision, every letter steady despite the age of the woman who had left it behind. Around them, the community center remained alive with cheerful conversation. Children laughed while volunteers unloaded canned food from pickup trucks. The ordinary sounds made the envelope feel even more extraordinary. Sebastian waited without speaking. He understood that some answers belonged to the person they were meant for. Claire slipped one finger beneath the seal and opened it carefully. Inside rested a single folded letter and an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The compass symbol was engraved into the head of the key. Claire unfolded the letter, her heartbeat growing louder with every passing second. The handwriting matched the note she had discovered inside her backpack. It read, "Dear Claire, if you are reading this, then kindness has once again found the right person. You never knew who I was, and that was always my intention. The groceries were never important. Your willingness to help without asking for anything in return was. Many years ago, I promised someone that if I ever found another person with that same quiet heart, I would trust them with what I could no longer protect. The key belongs to a safety deposit box at Harbor Trust Bank in Boston. It has remained unopened for 19 years. Everything inside belongs to the future, not the past. Please do not blame yourself for what followed our meeting. None of this began with you. You only reminded me that hope still existed. Trust the man standing beside you. He has spent years protecting people who could never repay him. You may not understand his world yet, but I believe he will help you carry this burden better than I ever could. Thank you for choosing kindness on an ordinary rainy afternoon. It saved more than you know." Claire lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak. She read the final lines again, searching for hidden meaning, but the message remained beautifully simple. She looked at Sebastian. "She knew you." He accepted the letter carefully, reading it in silence before returning it to her. "Apparently she knew more about me than I knew about her." Claire looked down at the small brass key resting against her palm. It was heavier than it appeared, worn smooth by time as though it had waited patiently for nearly 2 decades to fulfill a promise made long ago. "Harbor Trust Bank," she whispered. "That is where the answers are." Sebastian nodded. And someone clearly wanted to make certain those answers reached the right person. What Claire did not know was that Harbor Trust Bank had quietly maintained one of the oldest private vault systems in New England, where forgotten family documents, military records, and legal archives sometimes remained untouched for generations. The elderly woman had chosen a place where patience mattered more than urgency. Sebastian thanked the volunteer before guiding Claire toward the waiting sedan. Neither of them hurried. There was no longer any reason to chase guesses when the truth had finally offered them a destination. As the vehicle pulled away from the community center, Claire watched the volunteers continue their work through the rear window. She suddenly understood why the elderly woman had never tried to explain everything in the parking lot. Some stories could only be understood after trust had already taken root. "You have been very quiet," Sebastian observed gently. Claire smiled faintly while looking at the letter once again. She believed in people. Yes, that feels rare. Sebastian looked out toward the Atlantic Ocean, stretching beneath the afternoon sun. Rare things are often worth protecting. Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the brass key inside her backpack, treating both with the same care someone might give an irreplaceable family photograph. The fear that had followed her since the rainstorm had not disappeared completely, but it had changed into something steadier. Purpose. She no longer wanted to escape the mystery. She wanted to finish it. The road curved south toward Boston while sunlight shimmered across the water beside them. For the first time since they had met, neither Claire nor Sebastian felt like strangers brought together by coincidence. They had become partners, carrying the same unanswered question toward the same destination. And somewhere inside Harbor Trust Bank, a locked box had been waiting 19 years for the sound of one small brass key. Harbor Trust Bank occupied one of the oldest granite buildings in downtown Boston, its tall columns and bronze doors carrying the quiet confidence of a place that had survived generations without needing to prove its importance. The afternoon sun reflected across polished windows as the black sedan stopped along the curb. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk, with the brass key resting securely inside her jacket pocket. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last, not because of fear anymore, but because she sensed that whatever waited inside would finally explain why an ordinary act of kindness had changed the direction of her life. Sebastian walked beside her without speaking. His presence had become strangely reassuring. He never rushed her, never reached for the key, and never suggested that he deserved answers before she did. The marble lobby echoed softly with quiet conversations and the steady ticking of an antique clock mounted above the reception desk. An elderly bank manager greeted them with practiced courtesy until Claire placed the brass key on the polished counter. His expression shifted almost immediately. He looked at the engraved compass, then back at Claire. "May I see the accompanying authorization letter?" he asked gently. Claire unfolded the handwritten letter from the elderly woman and handed it to him. He read only the final paragraph before nodding slowly. "Please come with me." The manager led them through a secure hallway lined with framed photographs documenting more than a century of the bank's history. They descended one flight of stairs before arriving at a quiet vault protected by thick steel doors that looked untouched by time. Rows of safety deposit boxes stretched across the walls in perfect order. The manager stopped before one small brass compartment near the center. A faded number had been engraved beside the lock nearly 20 years earlier. "This box has remained unopened since it was first registered," he explained. "Annual maintenance fees were paid in advance through a charitable trust." Claire exchanged a brief glance with Sebastian before carefully inserting the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. The manager stepped back respectfully while Claire slid the small metal drawer onto a nearby table. Inside rested only 3 carefully preserved items: a leather-bound journal wrapped in protective cloth, a sealed envelope addressed simply to whoever chose kindness, and a thick folder containing legal documents. Claire reached for the envelope first. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was another handwritten letter. The familiar handwriting immediately confirmed that the elderly woman had prepared everything long before meeting Claire. The letter read, "If this box has finally been opened, and the promise I carried no longer belongs to me." Many years ago, a group of anonymous families created a charitable trust after a devastating hurricane destroyed thousands of lives. They believed that true generosity should never become a monument to personal wealth. Every dollar was given without names, without recognition, and without expectation. We chose the compass because hope should always point people home. Over the years, many tried to discover who financed the foundation. Some wanted recognition, others wanted control. We protected the truth by separating it from ourselves. The journal explains everything. The legal papers transfer the remaining charitable trust into the care of an independent public foundation. The final trustee was never meant to be chosen through blood, power, or influence. Only through compassion freely given to a stranger. That is why I chose you." Claire lowered the letter slowly. Her eyes, she had expected secrets about crime, hidden fortunes, or dangerous conspiracies. Instead, she found something far more profound, an inheritance built entirely upon anonymous kindness. Sebastian carefully opened the legal folder while Claire held the journal. Inside were notarized documents establishing that the remaining assets of the charitable trust had already been transferred into a permanent non-profit organization dedicated to disaster relief, scholarships, emergency medical training, and community recovery programs. Claire recognized several hospitals listed among the future beneficiaries. One of them sponsored nursing students. She looked at Sebastian in disbelief. This was never about money for themselves. He shook his head slowly. No, it was about protecting generosity from becoming ownership. What Claire did not know until that moment was that Sebastian had quietly spent years funding similar community projects through private donations that never carried his family name. Neither of them had realized their lives had been shaped by the same philosophy long before they met. Claire opened the leather journal to its first page. Written beneath the compass symbol were 7 simple words. Kindness survives only when someone chooses it again. She looked toward Sebastian, whose calm expression softened into the faintest smile she had ever seen. For the first time since the rainstorm began this extraordinary journey, the mystery no longer felt like a burden waiting to be solved. It felt like a responsibility waiting to be accepted. Claire carried the leather journal out of the vault as though it contained something far more fragile than paper. The afternoon sun had shifted lower across Boston, casting long bands of golden light through the bank's tall windows. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups, briefcases, and grocery bags, unaware that a promise nearly 20 years old had finally reached the person it had been waiting for. The ride back to the estate felt different from every journey before it. Neither Claire nor Sebastian felt pressured by unanswered questions anymore. The mystery had revealed its true purpose. It had never been about hidden wealth or secret power. It had always been about protecting compassion from becoming something that could be bought, claimed, or controlled. Claire rested the journal across her lap, occasionally running her fingertips over the worn leather cover. "May I ask you something?" she said softly. Sebastian looked away from the passing skyline toward her. "Anything. When that woman told me to trust you, why do you think she believed you would help?" Sebastian remained quiet for several moments before answering. "Because she probably spent enough time watching people to recognize the difference between influence and responsibility." Claire smiled faintly. "That sounds like someone who knew you well. I do not believe we ever met." He paused. "But people leave quiet footprints in each other's lives without realizing it." Claire thought about those words as the city slowly disappeared behind them. The elderly woman had changed her future with nothing more than groceries, a handwritten note, and faith in a stranger. Yet every answer inside the journal had confirmed exactly that. When they returned to the estate, Mrs. Ellis welcomed them with warm soup, fresh bread, and gentle relief visible in her smile. "You both look lighter," she observed kindly. Claire laughed softly. "I think we finally understand why all of this happened." Mrs. Ellis nodded as though she had expected nothing less. After dinner, Claire carried the journal into the quiet library where everything had begun. Evening sunlight filtered through the tall windows, bathing the bookshelves in soft amber light. Sebastian joined her a few minutes later carrying 2 cups of tea. He placed one beside her before taking the chair across the table. Claire opened the journal carefully. The first several pages described families rebuilding neighborhoods after the hurricane, volunteers sleeping inside churches, doctors treating patients without charge, and teachers reopening classrooms before their own homes had even been repaired. No wealthy benefactors seeking recognition, only ordinary people choosing generosity when life had given them every excuse not to. Several pages later, Claire stopped reading. "Listen to this," she said quietly. She read aloud. "The measure of a life is not the fortune someone leaves behind. It is the number of strangers who quietly stand taller because kindness reached them at exactly the right moment." The room fell silent. Sebastian lowered his eyes briefly before looking toward the fire burning gently across the library. "I spent years believing protection meant solving every problem alone," he admitted. "Perhaps I misunderstood." Claire closed the journal. "You protected me without asking for anything in return." Sebastian met her eyes. "You reminded me why it mattered." What Claire did not know was that those simple words marked the first time in many years Sebastian had spoken so honestly about himself to anyone outside his closest circle. The walls he had built through responsibility and caution had begun to change, not because someone demanded it, but because someone had quietly earned his trust. Claire stood and walked toward the tall window overlooking the gardens. The same stone fountain shimmered beneath the evening sky, where rain had fallen only 2 nights earlier. It seemed impossible that so much had changed in such little time. "I still want to become a nurse," she said. "Then become one," Sebastian answered. "Nothing about this story changes that." She turned toward him. "And the foundation," Sebastian smiled gently. The foundation already found the person it was waiting for. Claire looked back at the journal resting on the table. She no longer saw it as an inheritance. She saw it as an invitation, not to become someone different, but to remain exactly the person who had chosen to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. Outside, the last light of day settled across the gardens while the compass engraved on the brass key reflected one final ray of sunlight. For the first time since the rainstorm, Claire felt something stronger than relief. She felt certain that the future waiting beyond the estate gates belonged not to fear, but to every quiet act of kindness that had led her there. 3 months later, spring arrived quietly in Boston. The last traces of winter had disappeared from the sidewalks, replaced by flowering trees, open cafe windows, and the familiar rhythm of a city beginning another season. Claire Dawson crossed the courtyard of her nursing school carrying a backpack that no longer felt as heavy as it once had. Classes were harder than ever, clinical rotations demanded every ounce of her energy, and long evenings were still spent studying instead of sleeping, yet something inside her had changed forever. She no longer measured success only by the grades she earned. She measured it by every patient she comforted, every frightened family member she reassured, and every stranger she chose to notice when everyone else hurried past. The charitable foundation established from the trust had officially opened 2 weeks earlier. True to the wishes recorded inside the leather journal, no building carried a wealthy family's name. No statue stood in anyone's honor. Scholarships quietly appeared for nursing students, emergency responders received additional training grants, and small community clinics discovered anonymous funding arriving exactly when they needed it most. Newspapers praised the generosity of an unidentified donor, never realizing they were writing about a promise that had survived nearly 2 decades without belonging to a single person. Claire preferred it that way. One Saturday afternoon, she volunteered at a neighborhood health fair sponsored by the foundation. Children laughed while nurses checked blood pressure. Physicians answered questions, and volunteers distributed fresh food to families preparing for the week ahead. The atmosphere reminded Claire of the community center where everything had finally begun to make sense. She was helping an elderly man carry 2 boxes toward his car when she caught herself smiling. The simple act felt wonderfully familiar. Sebastian Romano watched from across the park, standing beneath the shade of an old maple tree with a paper cup of coffee in one hand. He had arrived without security surrounding him for the first time Claire had ever seen. He no longer looked like a man carrying the weight of an entire world alone. Responsibility still rested on his shoulders, but it had been softened by purpose rather than burden. Claire walked toward him after finishing with the volunteer tables. "You came," she said. "I was not sure you would actually take a Saturday off." A faint smile appeared across his face. Mrs. Ellis insisted. Claire laughed, immediately recognizing the truth in those words. They began walking slowly through the park while families enjoyed the warm afternoon around them. There was no urgency anymore, no mystery demanding answers, no strangers hiding in the rain. Only 2 people whose lives had quietly changed because one ordinary afternoon had refused to remain ordinary. "I visited the retirement community yesterday," Claire said after a while. Sebastian looked toward her. "Did they know what happened?" She nodded. "They told me she spent years volunteering without ever talking about herself. They said she always believed that people become who they practice being." Sebastian considered the sentence thoughtfully. She was right. Claire looked toward the children playing near the fountain. "I think about her every day." "So do I." They stopped beside a stone bench overlooking a small pond where sunlight danced across gentle ripples. Claire reached into her backpack and removed the brass key, now attached to her everyday keychain beside her apartment key and school identification card. "I almost left this at home today," she admitted. "Then I remembered it was never really about opening a box." Sebastian nodded quietly. It was about opening a future. Claire slipped the key back into her pocket. Thank you, he looked at her with quiet surprise. For what? For opening your car door that night? Sebastian smiled more openly than she had ever seen before. Thank you for getting inside. They stood together in comfortable silence while a light spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the park. Around them, volunteers packed away folding tables as another successful community event came to an end. Claire noticed a young college student stopping to help an older woman whose shopping bag had tipped onto the sidewalk. Neither of them realized anyone was watching. The student simply knelt, gathered the scattered groceries, accepted a grateful smile, and continued walking toward the train station without waiting for recognition. Claire felt warmth spread quietly through her heart. The promise inside the journal had not ended with her. It had simply continued the way it always had, passing from one ordinary act of kindness to another. As the afternoon sun reflected across the pond, Sebastian and Claire began walking toward the park entrance together, not because either of them needed rescuing anymore, but because they had both learned that sometimes the smallest choice offered without expectation could quietly change the direction of countless lives. And far beyond the noise of the city, where spring light replaced the memory of rain, the compass that had once pointed strangers home had fulfilled its purpose once again.